off with the hotfix update before we get right into the classification presentation. First thing to note, a couple of hotfixes have been updated since our last user group, which was mid-August. We have release notes on mobile 9.3 and list of changes, so check that out on the support site. Got the support article number listed there. And scan source error, check that out. Another one published in August 24th rather. And failed to crop images if you're using photodocs. And if anybody doesn't know what photodocs is, wow, we covered photodocs in a previous user group session, and that was a rousing conversation, photodocs. So definitely check that out on YouTube if you haven't visited our YouTube station. And you can see a whole demonstration and user group session on photodocs. All right, so product updates. We have 2 product updates, none for Laserfiche. There's no updates from last month, but we do have a couple updates for the city's digital integration. So Junxure Integration, hello Junxure users, there's going to be a very major update available for you in the next few weeks. Junxure Integration free. So this is going to simplify the installation process, lots of stability improvements. We have an updated contact viewer, and I've got some screenshots for you as well. Improved performance really is what this was all about, and ability to run the contact import utility as scheduled tasks, because that could be something that might need to run for quite a while. Multiple levels of subfolders are now supported by the integration. That is the biggest request from all users with the Junxure integration, so that's a really exciting feature. All settings are stored as Laserfiche user attributes, removing the external file database dependencies, which could cause problems. So here's just a quick view on what it looks like. You can see much more updated icons. Looks like much more modern integration because the interface has largely been the same for the last few years. And as far as the configuration, creating your multi-subfolder briefcase so it can be imported, you can configure that. And you can import all the allowed classifications from Junxure as well. So exciting new features. You can also set your synchronization settings right in the integration setup. Next on the list we have the Appellate Manager. This is an application used by courts in different markets around the country. Our Appellate Manager is now up to version 1.3.1. We've added a number of different features for the alphanumeric subnumbers. We also updated separately the forms word fill, forms payment utility, and the conversion utility that we have. So a couple of different updates that have been applied. For the Appellate Manager, here's a couple of screenshots if you're interested and you maybe don't use it yet. Appellate Manager, again, if you're not running a court, if you're not a clerk of court, this is not going to be applicable, but the Appellate Manager is a great utility that we've been seeing a lot of success with in different states. If you need a copy of this, by the way, the PowerPoint slide deck will be available to you, and if you sign up on either the webinar or you're here in person, you'll get it automatically emailed to you. And of course, you can watch this on YouTube. So the hotfix support update, this is just sort of a recap from last month. The Windows 10 compatibility is available, and current version of the Laserfiche suites can be installed on Windows 10. So if you are itching to get Windows 10 up and running, you are good to go. All right. So without further ado, I will be handing this off to Eric Anderson. We'll take a look at quick fields, and school's in session. Now it's time for classification.
Well, hello everyone. Some of you were here this morning for the workshop, but for everybody on the simulcast and for the new folks here, I'm Eric Anderson. I'm one of the systems architects and trainers at Cities Digital. I do a lot of configuration and training and setting up new systems and enhancing old systems. So to start off with our classification demonstration, we're going to switch over to a virtual machine where we can actually build out a classification, a multi-class quick field session. All right, so to start off, we'll open up quick fields. and we'll start a new session. So we're going to use the new session wizard to get this up and running. Now, every time you bank a quick field session, it's going to ask you to create a new session, and this is going to be your original classification. So we're going to need to call this our one of our document types. So let's take a look at the document types that we're going to use for this. There we go. So we have 5 different document types, or 6 different document types. And let's just start off with the first one in the list to get this started. Any moment now. So we'll start off with our residential loan application. So we'll make a class for this. We'll use the full wizard just to get this started. We're going to use universal capture because we're pulling from a Windows folder. The other options are different scanner drivers, and then there's also the Laserfiche capture engine, which pulls documents out of a Laserfiche folder as opposed to a Windows folder. And then we can go into our scan source setup, and this is where we tell it where we want to pull documents from and how we want to handle them when they come into QuickFields. So we'll set our path as our documents for classification folder. And we'll limit it to PDF files. Under document content, we can keep each file as a separate document, but that's not really going to matter because we're going to be using first page identification for a lot of this. We'll generate Laserfiche pages and we'll convert them to black and white. And we can scale these images to 300 dpi automatically when it converts them. There's some other PDF handling options here that you can investigate, a lot of which have to do with keeping the electronic file after it's been brought in, generating pages, and just general PDF handling that you would see in the normal document options in Laserfiche itself. Under post-processing, this is where you decide what you want to be done with those files after they've been scanned. So for the demonstration, I'll just not do anything. Those files are going to stay where they are. But in practice, I'd either delete them or I'd move them to a /processed folder somewhere in case I wanted to take a look at the original files again. And then you can set some retrieval limits. I typically don't change these. The defaults are generally exactly what I need. But you can take a look at these and see if there's anything here that you might want to incorporate into your own systems. Next, we'll select a server and a repository. We'll log in and validate. And we'll create our residential loan app. And now it's going to ask us for a sample page for this session. Now this, I'm actually going to leave the way it is right now. We're actually going to bring in sample pages in a different way later on. And you can set up some defaults for this document class. And right now, we're just not going to use a template because we're going to focus on identifying the class itself. And we'll skip over that as well. And now we're ready to start building. So under classification, you'll notice we have one document type. And obviously with document classification, the idea is to be able to scan multiple document types. So if we want to add another document type, we'll just find out what our next document type is, which is the consumer loan app. We'll double click in the middle and we'll add that class. Again, it's going to ask us for credentials because this will file on its own in its own way, because you can actually have different settings for all of these different classifications. Our next classification type is an employment application. So again, we can right click here if you don't want to double click in the center there and do new document class, and create our employment app. And now that we have a few here, let's talk about the sample pages. As far as the sample pages are concerned, in the pre-classification processing, you'll notice we have page 1 from each one of these different classifications. The problem here is that page 1 is all going to be this sample image. So if we actually click on the classification itself and go into samples, we can actually say create new sample page or configure sample pages. And I typically go into configure sample pages because I think it's easier to visualize. It gives you kind of a layout here where you can actually see, and it's not a whole lot of drop down and side pop-out menus. I think this is just easier to work with. And we're actually going to import a sample of our residential loan app. Yes, of our residential loan app. And these samples need to be TIFF images. So we're going to import a TIFF version of this. And you'll notice it's actually going to give us sample pages for every single page. But what we're going to do is the only page I really need is page 1. So we'll actually get rid of a lot of these extra pages. And we'll leave it with page 1. So now that we have a sample page set for residential loan applications, if we go into pre-classification processing, under samples, if we select this, now we actually have that residential loan app to work with in our pre-classification processing. Now this is really important because we're going to use Zone OCR to identify all of these document types. So we're going to want to make sure that all of these samples for each and every document type is available in pre-classification processing. So under consumer loan app, we'll go to the sample page configuration, and again, import our consumer this time. And we'll do the same for the employment application. Now next, we actually have a W4 that we're going to use. So we'll create a W4 classification. And we'll exchange our sample page. And then lastly, we have let's open this up and find out what this is. It is a building permit. So we'll create a building permit application. And again, we'll configure our sample pages to use our building permit. So now you'll see we have 5 different document classes created on the left-hand side with a whole bunch of different sample images. So when we go up into pre-classification processing, I have the option of looking at page 1 of the residential loan app, consumer loan app, employment application, W-4, and building permit. So now we're going to need to think, well, how am I going to identify these? Well, we're going to use Zone OCR for this one. So we'll add our OmniPage Zone OCR. And if we go back to our residential loan app, we're going to want to identify what might be unique about this. And obviously, it'll be the title, the Universal Loan App, or Uniform Residential Loan Application. So we'll start off by setting our zone to fit that area. Now, if we move on to the next document type, there's not really a whole lot in that zone that we can identify by. Same with the third one. It's a little off center here, or a little too high. This one, there's not a whole lot that we're going to get out of this either. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and make adjustments for every single one of these without losing this original zone that we made. So for this one, I think we're probably going to want to use some information over here. Maybe consumer loan application and identify by that. So we'll just take this and we'll extend it to include that information over here. So now if we move on to number 3, still not quite in the right place to pick up sample employment application form. So we'll make some adjustments by making it a little bit bigger to encompass this area here. Now if we move on to the W-4, there's a lot of information here. Obviously it's a tax document, so there's going to be a whole lot of verbiage here that nobody's really going to want to read through. Very tedious. But the biggest and most identifiable thing on this form is going to be Form W-4 2015. So we'll want to include this information here. So again, we'll extend what we've already built to encompass that. And lastly, we have our building permit application. And this one we don't even need to make any adjustments for. The area that we're going to really want to target here is going to be the Development Review Customer Service Center. And that's already well within our zone. Now, one thing that many of you might know about Zone OCR is that by default, it only does one line. So if you want to change that, you need to go into the advanced settings and tell it that you want it to return multiple lines. And what this means is if this was set to return one single line, most likely the only thing it would return would be development review and then nothing else. But because it's multi-line now, it'll return development review, customer service center, 250 South 4th Street, room 300. And now if one of your considerations is that the size of these documents and resolution is going to vary, I usually recommend you switch from pixels to percent. And what this does is it actually uses percent of the page in reference to the sample page versus pixels themselves. So if this is, and it's a 300 DPI document, if I was to scan in a 150 DPI document, this section would be much larger and take up like most of the page. Whereas if it was a 600 DPI document, this would probably take up about this much. But by using percent, it's actually going to adjust itself for the different resolutions. Now, the next thing we're going to need to do is tell it how to identify these different document types. So for our first page identification for each one of these, we're going to use something called token identification. So we'll add token identification, and we'll add our conditions. Now, anybody who's worked with workflow before is familiar with the condition editor. Basically, what we're going to do here is we're going to try and give it some rules to identify this document, without being so strict that you run the risk of it misidentifying it based on OCR accuracy. So a lot of times what I'll see is people set up their zone OCR and say, I want my zone 1 to equal uniform residential loan application. Now, what kind of issues do you think we might run into if we try and run this all the time? Anybody who's worked with OCR or tried to read through the OCR file would know that it probably won't say that. It'll probably say something really similar, but there might be words run together with no spaces between them, or there might be multiple spaces between these words. It's not really the best way to set this up. So what we'll do is I'll actually say if all of these are true, and I'll say if our zone contains uniform, and then you can actually do a Control-C and paste these rules. So you can say uniform, residential, loan, and again, application. And the reason why you do this is because of that variable, the variability in the OCR where it can interpret one space as multiple space or leave them out altogether. So now that we've done one of these, we're going to do the same thing for each one of these, and we're going to want to keep in mind what we're going to use for our identifications. So we'll add our token identification again. Set it to if all, and then find our zone contains consumer, loan, and application. For our employment app, we'll just use sample employment application form. The W4, we mentioned using the form W4 2015 for this. So we'll go into our first page identification and set that up.
While you're continuing with this, Eric, I figured I'd just mention, in case anybody hasn't really worked with quick fields before, I'm just going to stand up here by the microphone so everybody can hear me, but in case you haven't really worked with quick fields in the past, classification, as you can see, what Eric's doing here is he's really building out a separate set of configurations for each one of these forms, which might be unique, and in this case they are all unique. But with quick fields, if you were to just put a collection of documents into the scanner and they all had the configurations for the W4 but none of the configurations for the other forms, quick fields would just think it's all one document, even though you might have 15 or 20 in there. And a lot of people that use quick fields will have just one specific document type that they're scanning. So for a financial planner, it might be applications, or it might be statements, or something like that. Whereas if you're in, if you work in city, it might be something like building permits, like we're seeing up here. It's a specific type of document. Now, if you have multiple types of documents in a batch, because not everybody gets just one type of document in all day, so you might want to have quick fields set up to recognize all of them. Classification is a great way to say, in one batch, when I run all my stuff through there, I want it to recognize A, B, C, E, F, G, all these different types of forms. That's where classification comes in, and that's a separate module for quick fields. So if you go back to your quick field station tonight and try to use it, and you can't find a way to do this, that's why, because you probably don't have classification. So it's an add-on module to the basic quick fields. And what I think is nice right now is we're using Zone OCR, but another way to classify is that Laserfiche has many different methods for classification. It could be the metadata on the document that's coming in that actually causes it to be classified, or it could be a barcode, or it could be the OMR bubble dots where people fill it in with the bubble dots. So a lot of different options for how to actually trigger the classification. And while I'm talking, I'll say I would love to hear an explanation too, when you have a moment, Eric, as to why you chose the pre-classification to do the zone OCR versus what I've seen in some other instances under the first page identification for zone OCR. I'd love to hear your
the biggest reason why I chose to do zone OCR and pre-classification processing, one, is because I'm using the OCR to identify the first page. And if I did that in the first page identification for a lot of these, it would have to essentially go through each classification and run the OCR 5 times to, if it was the building permit, it would run it 5 times to find out, as opposed to running it in pre-classification where it runs it only once. It's also best to run it in pre-classification processing because if you're running zone OCR in your, say, page processing for a specific document class, what you'll end up with is that OCR engine has to load every single time, whereas if it's in pre-classification processing, it loads and runs constantly. Now, everybody who knows anything about OCR knows that it can take a long time if it's running. You don't want to run it all the time on everything because it's going to take a long time. But you actually gain productivity by running it in pre-classification processing because the amount of time it takes to load that engine is greater than the amount of time it's going to take to run that zone OCR on every single page.
So in other words, instead of having to say, is it this type of document? No. Is it this one? No. Is it this one? No. And then having to start and stop. It's just saying, I've got 5 variables I'm looking for. Are any of them in this zone OCR area? Yes or no? And it's done.
Right. So
it's much faster.
In this case, it runs that OCR in the document 1 time and then compares that token against my token identification, as opposed to running it for each one and looking for specific things.
Just real quick, I know you have the different classifications and they're all listed underneath each other. I noticed that the first and second one both share the condition of loan as a token. Would that cause any conflict?
It would, but in the token identification, I actually have it set to if all.
Well, okay.
So that's a good point because I have loan in both of these. It might be a good idea to not have loan in either because we're looking for different variables.
Right.
But just because in order to identify this, I want to see consumer loan application.
Right. So if it said if any of these conditions were, that would be something you probably want to leave off. It's
right.
All, that'd be okay then.
Yeah, because if it said if any, then if it ran a consumer loan application through there, it would see loan in the residential loan application identification and it put it in there. So now one last thing that we can do before we run this and I show you exactly how this is going to turn out is let's give these each individual titles. Now, because this is focusing on the document classification itself, I won't go into gathering information out of the documents and filling fields and tokens and things like that, but these default document names could all have to do with variable information on each one of these forms. Each one of these classifications could be very in-depth, extracting all kinds of information out of each one of these forms and pre-populating data before it goes into Laserfiche. But for this one, I'm just going to give them very simple residential and consumer names, very simple ones just to kind of identify which class the document got identified as, just to demonstrate how it actually identifies each one of these and separates it out. So now that we have a name being applied to each one of these documents, let's run this session. So first thing we're going to do is save it. And now that it's saved, let's start scanning.
I think it's important to note right there, we're generating pages off PDFs as you're running
Yeah.
this through.
It's generating TIFF images as it's pulling these in and identifying them as the different document types based on the zone OCR that we put in place. So now, if we take a look at this, we've got actually what appears to be 2 building permits, a residential, employment, residential, consumer loan app, employment application, building permit 1, W4, and building permit 2. And I thought I heard somebody say something about barcode over there. It would work the same way. If you have different barcodes that identify different document types, this would be the best way to use it, because then you could put different barcodes on different document types, and that would be a really easy way to identify them, because the barcode reader actually operates a lot faster than Zone OCR.
Well, when you were doing that and it was uploading it and it was saying zone this, I see it a lot when we're scanning. It scans the barcode and it's listing stuff.
Yeah, it'll read the barcode, and if you're using barcode, it'll be a lot faster at identifying these, because the barcode reader itself actually operates a lot faster. So does anybody have any questions about anything they just saw regarding the document classification options? Any questions from the simulcast? All right. Well, if anybody comes up with any questions after the fact, just feel free to email us, and I'll definitely have some answers for you.